All right, it looks like it started a little bit earlier than that. um, okay, so we will go ahead and start in a minute, but let me go ahead and make this a little bit clearer. Hopefully you guys can see it. If not, let me know and see what we can do. Okay.
Looks
well, good. Great. Thank you, Sheila. Well, welcome everyone. So this is our July 2021 community call. And basically today we're going to talk about ORCID and DOIs and how they work together. I think you guys already know Sheila. So Sheila is our program leader for persistent communities identifier. And I'm Paolo Guhilde. I'm the newest member at Lyrasis, working with Sheila as your ORCID US community specialist. All right, so the agenda is actually available online, and hopefully you have access to that already. If not, we will go ahead and share it with you all. And also, currently right now, the sound is muted for everyone. I mean, the microphone is muted for everyone. However, after our presentation, we can go ahead and mute if you have any questions or discussions. At the same time, also during the presentation, feel free to use the chat box if you have any questions or comments. Our slides will be shared after the presentation, as well as a link to the recording to today's community call. And you can also use the closed captions in Zoom. There should be an icon that you can use for closed captioning. Just feel free to use that. So today we're going to talk about, also I just also want to point out our community call norms. I think you guys are familiar with this already. However, I just want to kind of remind everyone that to make sure that we are engaging respectfully throughout our discussion today, and feel free to ask any questions or seek any clarifications as needed. And there's also a link that you can follow to get information about the Lyrasis Code of Conduct. So today, this is our agenda. So basically, we're just going to do a brief introduction and just kind of quick definitions of ORCID and DOIs. And then Sheila's going to talk about some PID graphs. And then I will be talking a little bit more about DOIs within ORCID. And Sheila will finish us off with the ORCID IDs within DOIs. And then, of course, we will have discussions and questions right after. So what is ORCID and what is DOI? We probably don't really need to spend too much time on this one. I'm sure everyone's familiar with this, but just kind of a quick recap. So with ORCID, it's basically as your open researcher and contributor identifier. And we have a 16-digit unique identifier for individuals that sign up for free, basically, to register an ORCID ID. And that's actually my ORCID ID, and that's basically what your 16-digit unique identifier. For the most part, primarily ORCID is used around the world by publishers, research organizations, as well as funders. Digital object identifier are also unique persistent identifiers for objects. And with this, you must be a member of a registration agency such as Crossref and DataCite, and we will actually be using those two for our presentation today. So we're going to go through Crossref and DataCite to use to populate our ORCID works. And same as ORCID, DOIs are also used around the world by publishers, research organizations, as well as funders. All right, I'm going to give it to Sheila to talk more about this.
All right, thanks for the intro, Paolo. Yeah, some of this might be review for some of you, but I realize that not everyone spends all day, every day thinking about persistent identifiers like we do. So basically, I wanted to start the conversation here by just giving kind of a bigger picture look at, you know, what we can ultimately do when we're all using persistent identifiers like ORCID and DOIs, because really the more that everyone can use these identifiers, and not just ORCID and DOIs, also you may have heard of ROR, which is the Research Organization Registry identifier for organizations. And there are, you know, other types of persistent identifiers out there, but we're focusing on ORCID and DOIs today. But the more we can all use these identifiers in our workflows, the more we can actually make connections between different entities in the research and scholarly communication landscape. So basically connecting the dots between people, the organizations that they're affiliated with, funding that they've gotten for specific research, and of course works and scholarly contributions. And PIDs, or persistent identifiers, are basically a really important piece of enabling fair, you probably have heard of like fair data, fair practices. That stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So the more we can use persistent identifiers, the more we can make our research and scholarly outputs more fair, and see these connections between entities. And so this graphic on the screen here is from an article that's actually linked from the notes document that just talks about PID graphs and fairness. And basically a PID graph is where you can like use persistent identifiers to visualize a network or connections between entities. So Paula, if you go to the next slide, I have an example from our colleagues in Australia. Basically, what they've done is they've taken metadata from both ORCID records and DOIs, and they've kind of mapped out this network graph, or like visualization here that you can see. And this is from December of 2009, so over 10 years ago. At the time, with the ORCID IDs and the DOIs that were available in 2009, they were able to determine that there were about 1,500 research organizations working on coronavirus research. Of course, that's a hot topic now. But from the visualization, you can see there are some colors that stand out there. And right now we're just highlighting Great Britain, which is kind of the aqua color, and then the United States, which is the darker blue. I realize that this is maybe not visually the best, the most accessible image, but we borrowed it from our colleagues in Australia. So this visualization was created using the metadata within ORCID records and DOIs, and through that, you know, they did a search to see who's working on coronavirus research, and they were able to kind of graph it out. And then if you go to the next slide, this is the, you know, also data from ORCID and DOIs, but this was another look in December of 2020, which was just 6 months ago. You can see like how much more this coronavirus collaboration network has expanded just based on looking at that metadata within ORCID and DOIs. Almost 47,000 research organizations involved. And maybe there were that many 10 years ago, but not all of them were using persistent identifiers. So this illustrates not only the kind of things that you can do with persistent identifier metadata in terms of looking for specific keywords and then mapping out connections, but it also kind of shows the growth that has happened over the last decade in terms of adoption and use of persistent identifiers. And this is just one example to kind of get everyone thinking about the bigger picture and the type of things that we can all do when we're all using these persistent identifiers. So that's just a little peek into, you know, the broader picture. But now we're going to actually zoom way back in and talk specifically about where ORCID and DOIs come into play with both. So I'll pass it back to Paolo. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Sheila. So like Sheila said, we're going back to ORCID and kind of really take a look at how DOI work within ORCID itself. So today we're really going to focus more on the works and the populating the different populating the works within ORCID. So as you probably know, there are different ways that we could add works in ORCID. You can add it manually. You could add import a bib tag, use your PubMed ID or your archive ID. But today we're going to focus more on the DOIs. So the first one would be adding a DOI to populate your work. And the next one is more on the search and link, primarily looking into Crossref and DataCite. All right, so let's start with adding a work via the DOI. So I think all of us are kind of familiar already with DOI. And if you do that by clicking through that add DOI or add work through DOI, you will go ahead and enter your DOI here and retrieve your work details. Within that, the system ORCID will automatically populate the different kind of fields that's needed for the works. So you can kind of see here that you have that this is a publication, it's a book chapter, and then on the work identifiers you have the DOI and the link itself to the work. We already know that basically our DOI itself have embedded metadata within them. And then once you have that done, you basically would just need to add it to your work list through here. And that's usually at the bottom of the add work pop-up. And then, of course, you can set the visibility of that particular work. That's really up to you, or you can control it one by one through your work, or you can have it the same for all the works that you've entered there. And this is what it would look like in ORCID. So we have populated it. We have put my work here, for example, and the source here basically my name or me because I entered the DOI myself and kind of put that information or gathered that information within ORCID. However, we do have the metadata with the DOI, the ISBN, as well as any other pertinent information for this particular publication. Let me know if I'm going fast. Feel free to just let me know and see. So we're doing that kind of entering a DOI and gathering the work. Another way that we can do this is actually through our search and link functionality. With this, like I said, we're going to focus more on DataCite and Crossref, but you do have other systems here or other external systems that you can gather all of those information. It just really depends on, I guess, your subject area or the areas that you're working in. So let's start with Crossref. So when you click on Crossref through search and link, it will take you to kind of a login page. After the login page, it will ask you to authorize or an access to that particular system. Within this, in the middle of that are basically the different authorization that the external system, in this case Crossref, is asking. And then you can say, yes, I would like to go ahead and do that, or you can deny access to that. But with this, it's basically asking us to that they could add or update our research activities, our works affiliations, and rate information as well. That's for trusted organizations. So we'll go ahead and authorize access to it. And then that will take you automatically to the Crossref landing page. You can kind of tell that that your ORCID and Crossref is connected, partly because your name automatically appears on that search box. And also, if you see on the top right area, you can also, your name also appears there. It's kind of little right now, but you should be able to see a green button there, and that's your ORCID connection to Crossref. All right, so you can search here, looking for your works either through your name or a DOI, for example. But with this one, I'll just go ahead and basically click on my name or do a search with my name on it. So as you know, there's a lot of Paulos in the world apparently, and it's not just me. I wish I'm unique that way. But this is basically sort of like the different publications that fits the search that we were looking for. So you could look for your particular work and go ahead and add that and see if you have the different publications that you've done in the last few years or so. In this one, I can kind of see that I have 2 works. So let's go ahead and add one of that. It's just a closer look to it. So the first one is basically my publication. So I can go ahead and add that to ORCID. So by clicking on Add to ORCID, fairly simple. And then you just go ahead and click Yes. By doing that, it will automatically go to our ORCID works section. And this is basically that representation or that what it looks like in ORCID itself. So all the metadata, the title, all of the DOI is there. And one of the things that I want to point out in here is the source. So remember when we added a particular entry or works through just us entering a DOI, the source is just my name. Now that we went through Crossref, that particular source changed to basically with information of Crossref metadata search. So we can kind of see the difference between that area. And it also kind of tells whoever's looking at your record or your ORCID profile that that particular entry is from Crossref. Another thing also is Crossref will automatically populate your works in ORCID. This is kind of a different process, and it's through basically an automated thing, and it will go through your email to grant permissions. And this one I kind of just I don't really have that many publications, so I don't have an automatic system. However, this is sort of like the email that would come in through your ORCID email inbox, and then you can grant permissions through there. All right, so that was really our Crossref. Now we're going to move on to DataCite. And the same kind of process, when you click on DataCite through search and link, it will still ask you to connect as well as authorize the different permissions that it's asking you to, So you can go ahead and authorize that, and it will take you to this landing page. Now, right now it's a little bit confusing, but DataCite is working on making this a little bit better and making it a little bit more user-friendly. So at this point, you know, if you're looking, it's like, oh, I don't really know where to go. One of the things that I would suggest really is to go ahead and just do a quick Google search, for example, of, well, I should mention that there's actually a connection here now. As you can see that you have the ORCID ID, my name, for example, and the other names that I use sometimes for any other publications or any presentations out there. But here, to get to look for your publications, for example, one thing that I would recommend is to just go ahead and do a quick Google search for DataCite search. So if you click on that, and also you can see the URL here for DataCite search, it will take you to this page. It will actually automatically already log you in because we've made that connection through ORCID. And the same thing, you have the search box here. You can either search for your name or DOI. And in this case, I'm going to search for my name again. And then a presentation that I did. So I just kind of put this up through the system to make sure that it works properly. So a presentation that I did is on data site, for example. And then I want to go ahead and connect this or add this to my works in ORCID. So the same, almost the same kind of process is to go ahead and add it to your ORCID record. And then you will just basically click on OK. Once that's done, that particular citation or that reference or work, for example, is now in process to be automatically to be in your ORCID record. And this is what it would look like in ORCID. So the same thing, you have the DOI and all the other information. And also I want to point out that the source is data site for this one. All right. So another thing also that DOI works within ORCID is deduplication of works. So one of the things that we did earlier is to enter a work manually through DOI. So this is basically the same entry or work. And then I went ahead and also grabbed that work through Crossref and adding that through from Crossref to ORCID, we now have basically two entries or two records for the same work. One thing that we can do here is to kind of ORCID itself will basically stack them together into one particular entry. Since you have the same DOI, it will put them or stack them together. It will just appear as one. But one of the things that you can do here is actually change your preferred source, for example. Remember that by manually entering your DOI earlier, the source would be your own, so you just added it yourself. However, if I prefer to do make the Crossref record to be my preferred source, I can go ahead and change that. So by clicking on preferred source, you can kind of see that you have preferred source for 2, and then you click on that 2 part, and it should open up the 2 records. And within this, you can toggle between your manual entry as well as the Crossref entry. And then I'll go ahead and switch it to Crossref, for example, and I'll just go ahead and make that into the preferred source. And you can go ahead and basically do the same thing or the other way around if you prefer to do your own citation or entry, for example. So basically all you need to do is toggle those and change the preferred source. And now this is my preferred source, for example. So it's through Crossref, and that's going to be the one that anyone that would be looking at my profile, that's the one that they are going to see. All right, and one of the things that I want to mention that we created a connection between ORCID and our external systems, such as Crossref and DataSite, and then we provided that access to them. So if you go through your profile, for example, you go to your name on the top right area, and then there's a drop-down menu. One of the things you can do is take a look at your account details, and through that, you can kind of see who the trusted organizations are. And in this case, since we made that connection and authorized Crossref and DataSite, we gave them the authorization to do this different access type, basically changing or updating our works or affiliations and all of those other things. So you have that trusted organizations. At any time also, you can disconnect that trusted organizations or authorization just by clicking on that kind of trash bin icon there. And that should disconnect your connection between ORCID and Crossref or ORCID and DataCite. All right, and I think that's about it for me. And then I will pass it on to Sheila, and she can finish us off for today.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paolo. Yeah, the really great thing that I love about the Crossref and DataCite search and link wizards within ORCID is that even if you don't have any works that already exist that have DOIs, once you click that authorize connection, any works that you put out in the future, as long as your ORCID ID is contained in the DOI metadata, that will get automatically added to your ORCID record for you. And before I move on to this side note, I did get a question about the preferred source aspect. So if you have a work in your ORCID record that you added yourself that also was added from another source, and you set a preferred source for that, you would have to do that for each individual work. You can't just like set a preferred source once and then that would apply to all of the rest of the works. You do have to go into each work to set the preferred source. I'm also seeing a new question that just came in, which is, how does ORCID handle works with multiple DOIs? For example, just yesterday, I noticed a book chapter that had a DOI from the University of California Press, a JSTOR DOI, and a degrader DOI. If I were to import all three, would those appear as three separate works, or would they get grouped together as one work with three different DOIs? So that's a great question, and the answer is ORCID will only group works together if they have the same DOI. So you would actually have three different work entries for that same work because they each have a different DOI, which isn't ideal. So at that point, you would probably want to just decide which entry you want to appear and either delete the other two or set the other two to private visibility. But that's also, there are some best practices for when you're creating DOIs for an item. Technically, one item should only have one DOI, but I know that that is something that hasn't necessarily been followed for a variety of reasons. So you may run into a single work having multiple DOIs, but if you are creating DOIs for works at your own institution, you definitely do not want to create a DOI if the item already has a DOI from somewhere else. So that's a great question. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the side note. Paolo, if you want to stop sharing, I can share mine, or you can go through the slides. Okay, thanks. Okay, so just as a heads up, kind of as an FYI, ORCID is or will be soon looking into the possibility of actually pulling, if a work has a DOI, and let's say somebody enters a work manually just using that DOI function instead of going through Crossref or DataCite, ORCID is looking into being able to pull the metadata from the DOI and just enter that. So reusing the DOI metadata, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So just know that that kind of a heads up for that. That way, yeah, just like I said, if you enter a work that has a DOI, you would just take the metadata directly. Sometimes various systems, Scopus, other systems besides Crossref and DataCite, sometimes you'll actually have different metadata in that work citation than the metadata that's actually in the DOI metadata. So this would be to kind of help streamline that and make sure everything is more consistent, just reusing metadata from your DOI. I also wanted to let everyone know that DOIs, mostly we're familiar with them through journal articles, publications, and other works, but there's kind of a new development where Crossref is actually working with funders to assign DOIs to specific grants. And they're DOIs, but we're calling them Crossref funding IDs. So I think only a few funders have started adopting this, but we're expecting to see more of it. So if somebody is getting specific funding, ideally that grant will have a DOI. And so if you include the DOI of the grant in the metadata for funding, and then also ORCID has added so that you can show your funding identifiers in your works, we can connect all of this information together the more we use these identifiers in the metadata of other identifiers. So this is just an example of if you're adding funding to your ORCID record. And of course, if you're using the API to add works or funding, you can of course include DOIs through the API as well. But you'll see that, for a specific funding award, you can include a grant identifier, basically. I just saw a question come in asking if we expect the possibility that the grant DOI may be assigned retrospectively in the future. That's a really good question. I'm not really sure. I don't see why you couldn't do that. I'm not sure though whether or not funders are considering that. I think, yeah, I honestly don't know. I don't know what to expect because this is kind of a new thing. I think we're just trying to get more funders aware that this is a thing and they can assign DOIs to their grants. And then also making like the researchers aware that there is a unique identifier for their grant so that when they go to publish their manuscript that's related to the grant, they can use that DOI when they submit the manuscript to just tie everything together. So there are a lot of moving parts and pieces. I don't foresee any reason why you wouldn't be able to like retrospectively assign DOIs to grants. But yeah, that hasn't really come up for me yet, so I'm not fully aware of. If anybody else on the call has more info, feel free to pop it in the chat. And so this is just an example from Crossref. Yes, it is XML, but this is showing a grant DOI, a snippet of the metadata for a grant DOI. So you have, the project title, but anywhere where you are referring to a person within a DOI, you can use an ORCID ID to identify that person. And that's really recommended. Rather than just using the name, you want to always try to include the person's ORCID ID so that, for example, when this, when this grant gets a DOI created for it, because it has the person's ORCID ID in the metadata, it could automatically get updated on the person's ORCID record, and then everything would be tied together that way. And then of course you can see there's other information about the funding. This was just an example that I pulled from the Crossref website, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. And then in terms of like a DOI example for a work, this is from DataCite, just in their manual form that you can fill out to create a DOI. Again, anywhere you have a person, so in the creators field and in the contributors field, you can include an ORCID ID for that person, and it will automatically populate their name. And the more we can do this, the better. But you do want to make sure you have the right ORCID ID for that person. And so that's a topic for maybe another time in terms of the best practice for making sure you have the right ORCID ID for the right person. It just involves using the ORCID API to get that ORCID ID from the person. And so here's the example from DataCite, just looking at the XML again, that ORCID ID is included in the DOI metadata. So really what would be great for everybody to do is include ORCID IDs in your DOI metadata if you're creating DOIs, and include DOIs in your ORCID metadata when you're working with ORCID or working with researchers that are adding information to their ORCID record. So that's kind of what we wanted to get us started with in terms of discussion. I'm going to make it so that, well, actually, you should be able to unmute yourself and start your video if you want, or put things into chat. I did see that we had a few questions come into the chat, so I just want to address those first, and then I would love to hear from other people. There's actually a lot more we can talk about, but we wanted to just kind of start it there. Okay, so a recent question that just came in was, how will the cross-ref funding IDs be written? Will they be distinct from DOIs to distinguish between them? A cross-ref funding ID is a DOI, so it will just appear as, DOI.org and then the prefix and suffix for the DOI. So I don't think there's anything in a cross-ref funding ID that would make it that you could immediately recognize it as a piece of funding instead of a work. It's really the metadata behind the DOI that will give you that information. And then let's see, are you talking about funding agencies adding DOIs to grants or another entity doing this? That's a great question. Thanks for asking. To clarify, we're talking about funding agencies assigning a DOI to a grant. So, so basically for funding organizations, they would need to become a member of Crossref, and then they can start creating DOIs for their specific grants. Yeah, so that's really the goal here. The goal is not for like a university to create a DOI to identify a grant from an external source. We really need the institution that created the grant to assign the DOI to that grant. Very similar to DOIs for works, typically the publisher will assign that DOI, or if it's something that's going into your institutional repository, your organization will assign that DOI. So the organization who's responsible is supposed to be the one assigning the DOI. Okay, and then there was one question actually from earlier, which was, how do we get organizational IDs? So basically like ROR IDs. You might be familiar with GRID, which is basically transferring over to ROR. And then there's also Ringgold ID, which is a proprietary organizational identifier. So to get organizational IDs into ORCID records and into DOI metadata, it is possible to do that. I can show you just really briefly, at least within ORCID, for example. If somebody, of course, if you're writing employment information or other affiliations to somebody's ORCID record using the API, you can include your organizational identifier in that metadata. But if somebody's adding their affiliations to their ORCID record themselves, and they go to add, let's say they go to add, University of Oregon, that's always my go-to. If they select it from the drop-down, and it kind of automatically populates some of that information, you can't see it in this screen, but once they add it to their list and you click the little gray drop-down arrow in the entry, the organizational identifier will appear there. And ORCID is moving to ROR as like the primary organizational identifier, and then the Ringgold and GRID will map to that ROR entry. They're working on that right now. It's not ready yet, but once that is ready, we're going to do another call where we talk about ROR. So So that's how those organizational identifiers can get in there, and you can add them through the API too. And with, for example, with DOI metadata, I don't think this example shows it, but there is a place to put an organizational identifier there. And both Crossref and DataCite are already using ROR as the primary organizational identifier. So that's yet another persistent identifier that really helps tie things together even more. Okay, let's see. And Barry, thanks again for your other comment and question. Are funding agencies considering assigning DOIs, or are others discussing it as a great idea? So yeah, I think over the past year, Crossref was doing kind of like a pilot with some initial funders and now everything is working really well. And so funders are actually starting to do this. We do have some funding organizations that are members of our ORCID US community. And I know that at least a few of them are already members of Crossref and already starting to assign DOIs to their grants. So it's already been discussed as a great idea, and now funding agencies are either doing it or considering doing it. So yeah, good progress. There's still a long way to go. I mean, ideally, everyone would be using all of these persistent identifiers. So there's always plenty of space for growth and progress. I just got another question in about how the funding DOIs will work with the funding wizard within ORCID. So that's actually a really good question. For the main here, there is a funding section in the ORCID record. Mine doesn't have anything in it, but if you go to add funding, there is a search and link to add funding. Right now, it's just Dimensions Wizard, which is a database with funding from a lot of different organizations. I don't know for sure what the plan is, because Crossref already has the works or DOI search and link to add to works. I'm assuming that they will set that up for the funding as well, but I don't know for sure, so don't hold me to that. But that's definitely something I will ask ORCID about. But if it is a DOI for funding, it should get added to the funding section, not the works section. So hopefully that provides some info. Other questions, other comments? Does anybody want to share what you might be doing at your organization with ORCID and DOIs, or feel free to also unmute in addition to the chat. And feel free to interrupt me too if I'm talking and you have something you want to say. One other thing I will also point out is something called DataCite Commons, which is also a relatively new platform that DataCite is working on. But it's kind of based on that PID graph idea where you can have all of these different identifiers connected together in kind of a network. So for example, if you have a work you can search for, and it will show you all of the different identifiers and entities that are connected to that work. You can search for people. So for example, I'll just do me. And it should, yeah, it'll pull up, everybody that matches that. Obviously, this one is me. And then it'll kind of pull up all of my related information from my ORCID record. And then you can do the same thing with organizations. And I believe this is still under development, so it's not fully launched in terms of what they ultimately envision the functionality to be. But you can go to commons.datacite.org and start playing around in here. And I know that even though it's through DataCite, they work very closely with Crossref, and so Crossref DOIs are also indexed in this search interface too. So yeah, you can see it's basically pulling all of this information from my ORCID record, and then it shows all the different works that I have with DOIs and the type of works. So this is something that you can look at as well. Something cool and fun to play with. Let's see. I have a follow-up question about getting organizational identifiers into this wider picture, and wondering if the publishers are picking organizational identifiers up from the ORCID record, or if they're adding it themselves. So yeah, in terms of having an organizational identifier included in a work entry, I don't really think there is like a specific field within the ORCID works section where you would put an organization that is affiliated with that work. You would have you would probably have like the publisher, and that could be included in the citation, but you would not necessarily have an organizational identifier for that publisher, and you wouldn't have an organizational identifier for like the institution where the person works or something like that. So so that's a little bit limited actually in terms of the ORCID work. But if a work has a DOI and you go to the DOI metadata, that will have organizational identifiers for like the publisher and the affiliated institution. And so this is where that kind of potential next step that ORCID is considering taking in terms of if a work has a DOI, ORCID is looking into going to the DOI metadata and pulling that metadata from the DOI and displaying it in the ORCID record. So I think that would open up, the idea right now is that the ORCID record is really just a record of the works. It doesn't have every single piece of metadata for that work. And if it has a DOI, in the future, ORCID might be able to pull that additional metadata from the DOI, so that's also displaying in the ORCID record. So that's kind of a convoluted answer, but yeah, so right now having an organizational identifier in a work entry is not really a thing, but those organizational identifiers will be in the DOI metadata if they are there. Yeah, so I have another comment that's just the research maps, those collaboration network maps and visualizations are, you know, becoming more and more popular. And of course, you want your organization to be visible in the information that's used to create those kinds of visualizations. So yeah, in that regard, it also kind of depends on the person who created the visualization and how they did it, whether they're just looking for organizational identifiers or if they're looking for just the string or the name of the organization. But yeah, the more we can actually use identifiers, the easier it is to be specific about who was involved. Any other thoughts? Any other questions? I'll put up our discussion and Q&A slide.
So Sheila, on one of the questions earlier about having different DOIs in works, but it's actually the same publication, for example. So one of the things that you can actually do with that is you can combine works in ORCID in a way where you would click on those little boxes next to it, and a combined icon on top of your works will appear. So with that, you can combine the two works that you're doing. So let's say you have a JSOR DOI, or and then another the same publication with a different DOI. So you can combine that those two, and you should be able to. One of them will be your preferred source, but they will be combined together.
Right, good point, Paolo. Thank you. I had forgotten about that. Yeah, so ORCID won't combine them automatically, but as an end user, you can always, if you do have duplicates that aren't being combined, you can select them and then click combine. I'm not going to do it because once you can't reverse it, but I have done that for some of my works that don't have DOIs.
Right.
Yeah, so
it will prompt you. Yeah. So it will tell you that if you combine it, it can't be undone. So
yeah, you want to make sure it is the same work. I'm seeing another question. If I understood correctly, it sounded like you said Ringgold, ROR, and GRID have some committee currently in ongoing coordinating meetings. If so, is ORCID represented? So that's almost right. So Ringgold is really kind of separate because Ringgold is a proprietary identifier, so they're just kind of doing their own thing. However, GRID ID for organizations was started by Digital Science, and Digital Science actually agreed to use the existing GRID database as seed data for ROR. And ROR is kind of the newest thing, but ROR is actually like a community-led open project for research organization identifiers. So basically, the people that are involved with ROR, I think it's being led by basically California Digital Library and DataCite. They're working together. I think Crossref is also involved, and ORCID has been involved as well. So yeah, they're all these kind of open infrastructure organizations have been working together along with GRID. And an announcement just went out this week that Digital Science is basically going to be sunsetting GRID and moving just everything over to ROR. I think in a couple of months, that's the timeline for that. So yeah, they've all been working together. ORCID has definitely been involved in those discussions. As I mentioned, both DataCite and Crossref are now using ROR identifiers for organizations. ORCID is just working on that right now. So soon you'll see ROR identifiers within ORCID as well. And then anyone who already has like a Ringgold ID or a GRID ID in their ORCID record, that will be mapped to ROR. I hope that answers your question, David. And Aaron, I'm excited for the future of PIDs. Thanks for all your work on making progress in this space. I'll be presenting on implementing PIDs in legal scholarship. Awesome. At the upcoming AALL annual meeting. Hopefully there will be sustained interest in legal scholarship to implement PIDs like ORCID and DOIs. Yes. Thanks, Aaron, for your comment. I completely agree. It will be good to start seeing more persistent identifiers in law reviews and that kind of thing. And, you know, other disciplines, I'm not, I know more about law because of the recent Hein Online ORCID integration. But I'm sure there are other disciplines that could catch up a little bit in that regard as well. Any other thoughts, questions? And I mentioned earlier that there are a lot of different persistent identifiers. There are just a lot. And if you're interested in learning more about other kinds of persistent identifiers, there is a relatively new opinions for persistent identifiers. And it's basically a discussion forum like what we have for the ORCID US community, but it's open to topics on all of the different kinds of persistent identifiers. So you can see like a recent post was about the grid ROR transition. There's information about DataCite, ORCID, all sorts of stuff. So think about, looking at the PID form if you want more information. Another persistent identifier I'm just gonna throw out there, but we won't talk about it too much in depth right now. It's relatively new, but it's called RAID, and it is an identifier for research projects. So you'll have like an overarching identifier for a research project that would then have other persistent identifiers underneath it for the people and the organizations and the works related to that project. So that's another kind of up and coming thing that people might be interested in. I see another question. Any plan to collect co-authors ORCID ID if the data is available from Crossref? Yeah, so co-authors, that is another reason why ORCID is looking into pulling metadata directly from the DOI metadata. Because if you're entering a work into ORCID yourself right now, there's actually not a dedicated field to add co-authors. That's another thing that we're working on. You can add co-authors in the citation, but that's kind of it's a bibtex and it's not structured and it's not easy to parse really. So yeah, if co-author ORCID IDs or names or anything are included in the DOI metadata, ORCID is going to be looking into pulling that directly from the DOI metadata. So yeah, that's a great question. There's all sorts of things we could keep talking about around these topics. Anything else? Anything that I've left out, Paolo?
No, I think we have everything. If there are any other questions, please let us know. I think we are about at the top of the hour now. So yeah, so any other last minute questions for Sheila and me?
And feel free to unmute. This is just an informal conversation. If you do have other questions, thanks everyone. If you do have other questions, feel free to contact us. And that's our email address. And we do, we have the ORCID US community. We also have our relatively new Lyricist DataCite US community. So if your organization is interested in creating DOIs through DataCite, let us know, because we have another group that is growing for that as well. You can't unmute, it's locked. Oh no. Sorry. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I thought I had it so that you could do it, but I guess I had it wrong. I'm sorry about that, y'all. I'm like, you can unmute. Actually, no, you can't. All right, feel free to contact us directly if you need anything. We are at the hour. Thank you for spending this time with us. I hope this was helpful. We will send out a link to the recording and the slides and everything, so stay tuned for that. And have a great day, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.